Okay, good evening or good afternoon. I would like to call to order. The sun is still out for the first time in a meeting that we've had in a while. I would like to call to order the March 7, 2022 Lake Washington School Board study session. Let the record reflect that all board members are present and participating remotely. Under the guidelines for attending board meetings, there remains a prohibition on in-person meetings, but there's an exception for meetings that can comply with the guidelines for business meetings found in the miscellaneous venues guidance. That guidance allows public meetings, but provides that all applicable face covering requirements as outlined in Proclamation 20-25 must be followed. This board values public participation and engagement in its meetings, and we will continue to comply with the laws related to open public meetings and all emergency requirements related to miscellaneous venues. If the guidance and requirements related to COVID-19 cannot be met, the board must hold its meetings remotely. Due to noncompliance at prior board meetings, the board has determined to hold its meetings remotely. The board will notify the public of the location of its meetings through the meetings tab on board docs. At this time, it is planned that board meetings will be held remotely until the guidance changes. Board meetings, study sessions, and special board meetings will continue to be live streamed on the district's website. If you're not able to live stream the meeting, you may call it to listen. That phone number is 425-936-2813, conference ID 37127. And I just want to add that when the board returns to in-person public meetings, that will be updated on the district's website for the forthcoming meetings. We have two items on the agenda for the study session tonight. The first is district textbook adoption process update for 6 through 12 social studies. And I think I saw Dr. Rose was here, but Dr. Holman, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you. As the board is aware and you've experienced before, as we go through these processes for adopting curriculum, we always invite the team to come and provide the board with an update, information around the curricula that are being evaluated and reviewed, where they are in the process, any challenges they're facing, and the successes that they're achieving. And so excited to talk tonight about our 6 through 12 social studies curriculum adoption. Our teaching and learning team is here to provide you with information tonight. Led by Mike Van Orden, Associate Superintendent of Teaching and Learning Services, Dr. Jen Rose, Director of Teaching and Learning, and excited to have Crystal Stevens here, Curriculum Specialist. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mike.
Yeah, and just briefly, as Dr. Holman mentioned, we like to come in before we actually come with a formal recommendation. Many times the questions that the board asks helps to inform the process, and we take those back to the adoption team members before we make our final recommendation. In addition, we want to keep you updated. As you recall, just the other night when we were talking with Mary Wilbur, we had some conversation about our social studies curriculum, so it's a very timely presentation tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rose and Crystal.
Great, thank you so much. We are really excited to be here. Crystal and I were talking today that we had seen Mary's presentation, and seeing the pieces of curriculum adoption and thinking about overall teaching and learning and how it locates everything within our larger world of teaching and learning is really interesting. So we're excited to be here tonight. This has been a pretty intensive and extensive adoption process, and are excited to share our process with you. Our goal for tonight is to go over the timeline. It has been, as you know, there's been a lot going on in the past 2 years. So we've had a 2-year process for social studies adoption and wanted to share that with you. Review our curriculum review and adoption process, the lenses by which we look at different curriculum and the process of it. Share with you who's actually on the committee, and all of the different stakeholders that we have on it right now and how we'll plan to go forward into the future. And then all the different pieces of work that we've completed thus far, and then our next steps based on board approval. But I wanted to, before we really dove in, turn it over to Crystal for a moment.
And I was lucky enough 3 years ago when I moved into this role and was able to establish a partnership with Mary and with the Snoqualmie tribe to be able to construct a land acknowledgement that our department has used consistently throughout our work, and especially through our work with the social studies department and this adoption. So I'm going to give you a moment right now to read that acknowledgement, and then I'll share a little bit more about how that's played a role in our adoption before we transition into some of that deeper conversation. So in connection to recognizing, again, those Coast Salish peoples, which I believe was a conversation that you had again with Mary also, and calling out those specific tribes within our district boundaries, we want to really recognize and acknowledge the fact that going through this adoption process has been a big part of acknowledging and honoring the tribal partnership we have as well. So we've been very conscious throughout this process to both keep Mary and our tribal partners informed and engaged. And you'll see that as we move through the presentation today. So thank you for honoring and taking a moment to reflect and acknowledge our tribal partners.
Thanks, Crystal. And I'll make a side note that this adoption has been one of our most significant, one of our largest, and it has been a truly collaborative process that we've worked with. And you'll see it in later slides, but we've worked with the equity department, we've worked in depth with Mary, we've worked with multiple departments to make sure that we're bringing multiple lenses to this adoption. So the reason for this adoption, we've been working on. We did the same thing with ELA that we're doing with social studies, where in order to have deep alignment across middle school and high school, instead of separating out a middle school adoption and a high school adoption, we've combined them. And part of the reason for that was that the learning that is needed for thinking about instructional resources is the same for middle school and high school. And to some extent elementary, but that'll be a separate adoption. But as you can see, it's been a while since our last adoption, 2008 for high school, 2009 for middle school. And so actually in the pandemic year, 2020-21, we've done some learning with the social studies departments before we got to the adoption process. Crystal came into the role 3 years ago, and we were able to work with departments, and then we were able to do some whole system learning in secondary content areas, and we're able to do some of the prep for the learning that would need to happen with an adoption. But we formed the adoption in 2022, 2020 and 21, and did our learning year. And then this year we're actively engaged in the review process, and then we'll move forward into the implementing year once we get a little bit further down the way. So the first year, and we'll go into more specifics, but we really take our time to do intensive learning. So the first year is really about updating everyone on the committee, and it was a sizable committee, with doing a deep dive into standards. And part of that was because OSPI updated their social studies standards in the fall of 2019. So it's very, very timely to be able to do an adoption because they adopted new standards. And to be able to get into looking at what are several metrics to understand how we're performing as a system, and then to use that as a way to think about how are we ensuring that we reach every student with really engaging learning. So that first year was really involved in doing deep learning, and then in setting up a system by which we could evaluate curriculum to ensure that we were making instructional decisions that were going to really serve our students. And then the second year, we actually dove in to do the actual evaluation of resources. So it was an intensive fall of looking at many different curricula that we'll show you in a few moments. And we're right smack in the middle of the piloting right now, and then we'll move into making decisions and bringing those to you. One of the things that has been a little bit of the impact of a pandemic and a little bit of the impact of the size of this adoption is we will not finish all of our piloting this year because of some timing pieces. We will carry forward our piloting and final decisions for all of our courses into next fall. And I follow the exact same process of evaluating and make a recommendation to you in late fall, early winter for some of our courses. So one thing that was exciting to us for this committee, this was the biggest adoption committee I think Lake Washington has had. We had 60 members to start. We had schools from representatives from all of our secondary schools. We had specialists from intervention, equity, teaching and learning, and tech integration. We had 10 community members, which is the largest number that we've had on a committee. And we had students, and they were a fantastic voice to have in the adoption process. And so that group stayed with us through all of last year during a really critical time of our learning and our development of our rubrics. As we came into the fall of 2021, and got into evaluating, we did have some effects of the pandemic and had some members of the group peel off, but we still have, on any given day, we have between 35 and 45 people showing up to our meetings. We've actually increased the size in another way, which is that we wanted to have as many teachers as possible pilot so that we could really evaluate how well does this curriculum work if you haven't had that year of intensive learning. We'll prep for learning, we'll prep our teachers with professional learning before they teach the curriculum, but we really wanted to have multiple voices in looking at the curriculum as we went through. So again, this was one of our largest adoption committees ever. And in our first year, like I said, we started focusing in on the social studies standards. The previous social studies standards weren't light years away, but the newer ones are, they're based on the national standards, and they really call into focus critical thinking, making connections across patterns, a whole bunch of different things that are different than what I think I experienced when I was taking social studies in high school. It's not a collection of dates. It's not a collection of events. It's much more deep thinking about concepts in multiple aspects of social studies. We also really wanted to recognize that curricular resources, instructional resources are what teachers use to teach, but the thinking and learning behind that is really important. And so in order for this group to be able to choose resources that met our deeper needs as a district, we engaged in significant learning with them. So we brought in Scotty Nash from the Anti-Defamation League, came in multiple times to work with us. We had a great partnership with the equity department, specifically Adana Abakporo, worked with us over multiple sessions where we looked at intersectionality of our students and thinking about how a curriculum adoption is, yes, about resources, but it's also about instructional strategies, and those things have to go hand in hand. We also geared this adoption on thinking about our goals for inclusion as a district. So as we're doing our learning, as we're evaluating resources, we're really actively thinking about how do the instructional resources we're looking at support universal design for learning and help us move closer to our goals for full inclusion as a district. And then we also brought in, of course, other resources from National Council for Social Studies and then from OSPI. So it was a very, very well-read committee as we focused in on learning. So we took that learning, and as a district, as we've presented before, we have 5 core district rubrics that we use to evaluate. So the committee, with all that learning, looked at those 5 core rubrics that are also informed by national research. And then we did some revisions of those. We kept a very strong focus on the standards, and we kept the best practice in social studies in there, and then looked at ways that we would want to really add parts to it. And the pieces that we looked to add to our district rubrics were really focused around equity and equitable practices and the attributes and elements of that. And the learning that we did with that, I'll get to in just a moment, because we wanted to make sure as we were looking at those indicators, there was another rubric that we used that was from OSPI that I'll pull in thinking about equity in a moment. But one of the ways that we wanted to look at achievement in social studies, it's not like Smarter Balanced, it's not like using FastBridge. We wanted to find data that would show us how our students are performing in social studies. And so one of the ways that we were able to look at that was through grades. So we did an in-depth analysis, and we looked at who's actually successful in our classes based on grades. And we found, not surprisingly, we found some pretty predictable discrepancies in who gets A's and B's and who gets C's, D's, and F's. And it was pretty eye-opening, because I think often when we think about social studies, it's hard to think, how do we measure achievement and how do we look for how students are accessing the learning? So this was something that was pretty powerful for our group to be able to think, Smarter Balanced aside, when we look at the experience of students and how they look at themselves as learners, what can grades tell us about that? So one of the things that we also did with that to help think about equity through our curriculum work was and this is something that's been fairly standard practice for us at this point, is to bring in additional learning from within our district. And so we had a panel of our district directors, so special education, intervention, accelerated programs, and equity come in and work with the group directly to look at what are indicators for curriculum that has access for all students. What are the indicators for that accessibility for curriculum? And a lot of that was around the mindset of the educator, or the mindset of how we think about using curriculum. So as we go through our learning, we're also really thinking about what is the professional learning that teachers will need when we have new resources with them. So we did, again, more focus on learning. So thinking about those grades again, we looked at what aspects would be really helpful for this group to think about as we go in, knowing that we'll decide on a resource, but that the perspective and then additional resources around the adopted resource are going to be really important. So we did some in-depth with the Since Time Immemorial curriculum, and that's been ongoing. That started before the adoption, but it's been a really core piece of the adoption, is to not have it be secondary or separate, but really think, how is this something that's embedded within the experience of teachers and students? And we worked with the Holocaust Center for best practices around teaching the Holocaust. Again, universal design for learning. And then the other piece that we've been doing with ELA and already with social studies is providing professional learning for teachers around designing and facilitating effective conversations about race and potentially controversial topics in the classroom. And in fact, that was the focus for our ELA and social studies teachers. Crystal led a team that included specialists from Equity and from Puget Sound ESD, and Crystal will remind me when I forget someone, but we had a multifaceted team, including our ELA specialist and Crystal, that designed professional learning on February 23rd that was really powerful. And if you're interested, they did a Padlet at the end for teachers to capture the change in their thinking or what they'll think about next in teaching, and that was really powerful. And part of that is, again, thinking instructional resources are a set of readings, assessments, all different kinds of things, but how we utilize those and the frame by which teachers teach those is really important. So that's been part of our learning as well. And then these are rubrics again. We have standards alignment, effective practice, assessment, digital resources, and organization and design. In January of last year, OSPI released this tool, the Screening for Biased Content in Instructional Materials, and that's become our 6th rubric. And that's been a really good check for us to be able to use side by side with our district rubrics, and after we implement, and this is the main way that OSPI has said they've seen people using this tool or plan to use the tool, is as a guide for implementation. We are very clear that as we go through looking at resources, we are not going to find one thing that makes us, there's not going to be one curriculum that we're going to go, that's it, the lights went off, it's just perfect. We won't find that. And so it's going to be really important for us as we go forward, like with ELA, to have tools that help us continue to be reflective year over year as the world changes. And I'll say that being in a social studies adoption in the years 2020, 2021, and 22 are very different than they probably were in 2018. And that to be able to have a thoughtful group responding to thinking about how we provide terrific learning for our teachers and for our students is really important. One of the other pieces that we've done is before we started this work, the content of classes was fairly general. So there was like a historical focus or a date focus. So world history would be the focus of one course. US history would be the focus of another. A major project that was, again, a multi-department, multi-division project was creating an online course catalog. And one of the offshoots of that, and this was tied directly with the work that we did in the adoption process, was to design course descriptions for all of our core courses 6th through 12th grade. And again, thinking about that alignment, so that 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, all of that learning builds on each other across the district so that we can say we've got guaranteed and viable learning. In that work that Crystal led, we had that subcommittee of the adoption team meeting, and then doing that same work of what is essential that needs to be in there. So social studies is not a date range anymore. Social studies is much more the essential standards and then the other pieces that come in with the essential standards. The standards don't say there should be one curriculum or one event or a set of events that need to be included. They're much more about the conceptual pieces. And so that was our work to be able to say, in addition to the conceptual pieces, what are the key instructional practices and what are the key key elements that need to be brought in? We had all kinds of outreach, especially thinking around collaborating with Native educators. So we had LEAP learning that connected with that. Both Crystal and I got to go to the event that Mary talked about. That was wonderful. There's been additional educator conference work that we've done. And then again, we've got the outreach via Mary Wilbur to the Native education parent programs and the work with Aligning Since Time at Memorial, and then just ongoing consulting. Our paradigm for adoptions now is also not that we finish the adoption and we're done, but that we keep an advisory of social studies teachers. Our adoption committee turns into our implementation committee, turns into our steering committee, so that we are not letting go, so that it won't be 10 years from now that we say, okay, time to change everything, but that our curriculum and our instruction needs for us to continually tend to it. So this work that's on the slide here is work that will be continuing. So Crystal, let me pause. Anything you would add about this work that you were focused on?
I would just add that the 2019 social studies standards, a major shift that did happen with them also that was tied to our alignment work was the fact that the state actually took the time to align the different STI or since time immemorial components to those different standard areas as Jen was referencing. So we took that as the guiding point to begin our work in doing our district alignment as well. So we've shifted to make sure that we're more in line with the state and their direction through this process also.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is just more details of this work that we've been doing together. And the slide that Crystal used to open the meeting is one that we've had as part of our adoption from the beginning. That teachers have also adopted, so it's been interesting to hear about the impacts with them using it with students as well. So that was the first year. Second year, again, we've been really focused in on deep evaluation. So we got all the resources in August, and then September through December and a little bit into January, we evaluated and used the rubrics and other factors to determine which resources that we wanted to pilot. We are in the pilot, we're in the first round of piloting right now. So that's been exciting. We've really been looking at, again, the standards and the rubrics in order to evaluate the curriculum that we wanted to pilot, and thinking also, again, how does what we pilot fit with our larger goals as a system? That social studies is one part of our vision for students and of effective instruction. There are other ways that we looked to identify what we wanted to evaluate. So we looked to see what other districts were using. We looked to see what teachers in the committee wanted us to look at and evaluate. We looked at what OSPI, Puget Sound DSD. We looked at every place that we possibly could to have the broadest amount of resources to evaluate. We also looked at EdWeek and other national publications to see what we could find. And we came up with 11 different curricula for grades 6 through 12, 8 of which were available at 9 through 12. So these are all of the different ones that we reviewed. And the list actually, we can show you a list of all of them. One of the interesting things about social studies and what makes this a particularly challenging adoption is that unlike like 9 through 12 ELA or 6 through 12 ELA, for social studies, each course has different authors. So a 6th grade course in Savas is going to have a different set of authors than an 8th grade course, and they're very different. So we determined we could not say we're going to adopt this, take this one publisher and look at it for all of middle school or all of high school. The variation between the courses was too great. So we've actually had to separate out into multiple subgroups and have each subgroup go through the evaluation process for the curriculum that fit that course, and then make decisions on which course they wanted to pilot with that. So it's been incredibly complex. Mark.
Could you give us for instance on how it differs from one age to another? It sounds great, and I'm just trying to visualize it in my mind, how it changes from 6 to 7 to 8. I don't know if you have a for instance or not. If you don't, that's fine, but I thought I'd ask.
Well, so the curriculum, so that the standards, so every curriculum company is going to say that their standards aligned. What we saw was actually deeper into the text. And so we saw, and Crystal, like if we want to be super specific, Crystal will remember exactly, but we saw like one curriculum was written clearly further ago, more years ago than another. And I don't remember I won't say the specific publisher, but the language used in one of the curriculum was outdated and offensive. And in the newer curriculum, they had recognized the terms that they were using in the older separate grade level were not appropriate terms to use anymore. So that disqualified some curriculum where those are some of the differences between them.
But the ones you're currently looking at, though, they have a difference between 6, 7, and 8 also?
Yes.
Okay,
so Mark,
that's what I'm trying to look for. I'm trying to get a kind of for instance, so I can visualize it.
So Mark, the 6th, 7th, and 8th standards at OSPI, 6th is world history, 7th is Washington history, 8th is U.S. history. So they're fundamentally different arenas.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The way it was described, I was under the impression
That's all right.
Thanks, Chris.
I've been through it a little bit more recently.
Yep. So yes, and the actual content is different, and then the way the resources that publishers provide us are very different as well.
It's basically different classes. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the way that we did the evaluation was, again, we had the way we've done every adoption. The subcommittee has a rubric. The subcommittee evaluates the resource with the rubric, the subcommittee discusses it, and then we have larger discussions with the whole group. The rubric groups, we just ask the teachers to evaluate one rubric in depth, or actually this one we would have them do two, so because of the size of the groups, go in depth so that we're able to compare organization and design against organization and design, as opposed to having many, many, many elements. We tried as much as we can to have it be very clear apples to apples comparison. So this is a slide that has a ton of language on it. This is from the tool that I told you about, OSPI Screening for Bias Content tool. Within that tool, it's actually like a 17-page document, but these are the main categories within that document that have more specific rubrics in it. So this is something that we attended to as we've gone through and that we use to inform our rubrics, and that when we make a determination of a final resource, we will again use this to identify, help us determine scope and sequence and identify any supplemental resources that might be needed. So again, we continue to have more folks from other departments come in and give us more information and help us keep our focus on how are we ensuring that the resources that we adopt will meet all of our students' needs and what professional learning teachers need with that as well. We use a consensus process, so this is just a little more on the process. We use it and the resources that we are piloting for each of these. So you can see at middle school through AP Gov, the resources that we're currently piloting. We use a consensus process so that we're able to have a really good discussion and use Robert's Rules of Orders to be able to move resources either further or to knock them off the chart. The rubrics and the process brings in other additional background as well, or other resources and other considerations as well in terms of thinking about how do we best meet the needs of our students. The way that we work the pilots is that every pilot teacher will pilot both curriculum that are for their course. We really want teachers to understand that it's a comparison process, because what we found is in the past, if people pilot one, they end up falling in love with that one, or they hate that one. So they'll pilot both resources and use them in the classroom. All teachers piloting are being trained in the materials. And as we go through the process, we'll collect student feedback, parent and community feedback, teacher feedback. And then we're also asking the equity department to do a deeper dive side by side with us with the resources that we're piloting. So like I said, we're right smack in the middle of our pilot process right now. It goes through the end of this week for the first resource, and then we'll do a quick turnaround and we'll pilot again with the second resource with the courses that we're piloting right now. And then we have had student feedback through, like I said, they were on our committee and in the learning process, which was terrific. They also did some work with their students back in their classrooms to get more input for them from their fellow students. We'll continue to collect student feedback through the pilot via a survey, and then also in discussions with their teachers. The teachers have been just terrific about asking for feedback as they're going along. Pilot teachers have directly emailed parents with links to the instructional resources. They've been up on our district website for 2 weeks now, I think, and they'll be up through the end of the piloting. Crystal and I are running a virtual parent night on Thursday nights. So we're doing lots of outreach for that. The two courses that are not piloting right now are civics and US government. And the bump with that is civics in most of our schools is taught in the fall. So when we got to the point in the process where we said, okay, we need to pilot civics, we don't have classrooms to pilot civics in. So we have the resources to take us through next fall with the current resources that we're using, but we'll pilot in the fall when we can actually get really good feedback from large numbers of students and teachers. US history or US government is also paused till the fall. We had a couple different issues come up, part of which was our high school US government teachers that were on the adoption committee were overwhelmed by the work that they were doing with COVID or just their classrooms. And so we didn't feel like we had enough US history teacher voice to be able to pilot right now. So we wanted to wait till we could get a large group of teachers and students together and do a really solid pilot. So again, we've got resources to keep us going through next year. So we'll do that piloting next year and then be able to do implementation planning as we get into the year. So we've got teachers piloting or giving us feedback through lots of different ways. We also had, before we started the adoption process, Crystal and I met with every social studies department to understand what their needs and their thoughts were before we even started the adoption process. And then we've got non-pilot teachers are welcome to offer input through community survey or through their committee members. Our community engagement has been, we've been putting regular updates on the website after every meeting. We've had several connections articles going out. We've got the letters from pilot teachers going out to parents. We've got stacks of resources at the Resource Center, our information night tomorrow night. And we've partnered with communication, so there's some social media posts going out about the resources that we have to get lots of input into it. So we'll conclude our pilot April 1st. We will make our decisions through the first 2 weeks in April, and then our goal is on May 9th to make a presentation to you about our final resources. Next steps, if we are approved with our resources, is to plan implementation as we go into the summer, into the fall. We also, when we adopt a resource that's as big as a social studies resource, we would not hand a large resource like this to teachers and say, here you go, teach things, you have resources now. We're really clear that that year that we did of professional learning and all of the focus on inclusion and culturally responsive teaching means that we need a solid scope and sequence that is able to ensure that every student in every course has a set of learning that meets all of our interests and that meets their needs. So we will do alignment with scope and sequence across the grade levels, across the year, and then across grade levels. We're going to continue to think about the professional learning needs. And like I shared with you about our February 23rd learning, we really recognize that the mind frame and the perspectives and the ability to lead conversations is going to be really important for our teachers, that they're excellent teachers, but that next step in when we're focused on this kind of a scope and sequence, what are the supports that they need, and how do we come together in professional learning for that? So our year 3 is going to be the implementation for the courses that we decide this spring, and then it will be moving forward with the pilot for those other courses. Our tentative plan is to provide teacher training during LEAP in August, and then be able to have time in LEAP time and potentially after school, whatever we need to do to help the implementation happen for teachers in the fall. We'll continue to have our adoption committee. We'll turn into our implementation committee, and they are a fantastic group of educators that are deeply, deeply committed. We also, when we adopt, will look at what's missing in the curriculum that we're adopting. We are looking primarily at pretty standard resources, curriculum publishers, and so we recognize that we will need more diverse authors and resources and perspectives. So that will be part of the implementation committee work, is to do that alignment and identify additional resources. This will also align with thinking around ethnic studies requirements from OSPI, that they've identified standards in social studies that align with the ethnic studies framework. And as we're going forward with our social studies adoption, we'll be able to align the ethnic studies framework with social studies standards and think about resources that align with that. And continue to think about inclusion. So as we're developing scope and sequence and providing learning for teachers, we really need to attend to universal design for learning and anti-racist instruction. We'll continue the collaborations that we've talked about. We'll absolutely continue to have student voice in the implementation planning. And one of the things I wanted to bring up was we'll continue to work with curriculum publishers. That's been something that's been, we've been fairly successful over the past few years with our recently adopted resources, where we've recognized, our teachers have recognized something that's missing in the curriculum, or additional learning that teachers need, or additional framing that would be helpful for students. And we've been able to work directly with publishers such as Amplify with our middle school ELA, and with Savas for our 9 through 12 ELA, to have them actually change their curriculum and either provide additional teacher resources or add lessons or change a frame for a unit based on feedback with us. And I want to do a shout out to our teachers for that and to the curriculum companies. But what's been interesting is that both Savas and Amplify said, with the things that we pushed back on and said this needs to change in your curriculum, we were the first district to do that. So that was pretty exciting that they were responsive, and it was a definite praise is due to our teachers for being passionate about advocating for curricular change. So I will pause and ask Crystal, is there anything that I missed? And then we'll just open it up for questions.
No, Jen, I believe you covered everything, so thank you so much.
Yeah, Chris.
So since this is social studies, it's a very specific question, but it's something that it's been on my mind over the years. And that is that I just looked up the history 6th grade standards, and they're still arbitrarily breaking at 500 CE between eras. And the problem that I noticed when my kids went through the 6th grade world history curriculum was that includes pre-500 pretty much all of the major world religions except Islam, which is the next century. And the net result is that Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity were all in our 6th grade textbook, and Islam didn't appear at all. That's a gap that has troubled me since I first discovered it. It's still there. So I know this is a very detailed question, but is Islam addressed in either the 6th grade or in the, I think it's 10th grade world history curriculum that we're looking at? Because if you don't have Islam, you can't read the newspaper and understand it. So,
yeah. So I'll give a general frame and then I'll ask Crystal to give specifics. So that what you've identified is there will be things like that, and there have been, that we as a system and then teachers have addressed. So that's like a perfect example of why we would need to continue to have that advisory and continue to look at our curriculum. But that is updated in the curriculum that we're looking at. And I'll let Crystal give more specifics on that.
And I would say all of the materials that we're piloting right now and looking at include Islam to some level within them. I would say the level of depth and the context in which they're presented varies, which depending on how we revise the scope and sequence, we'll need to make determinations about instructional support or material support potentially to make sure that we're feeling that need is met.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And also, the flip side of that is a praise. Thank you for involving ADL before there were any issues. This is a big deal. There are important issues that need to be addressed carefully and thoughtfully. So thank you for that.
Yeah, this has been just a really great collaborative learning partnership. And it's been the folks on the committee we're trying to distill down like what was most impactful for them so that we can ensure that that's what happens for the whole system. But the partnership of multiple departments within Lake Washington has been great.
And so if I understand correctly, Savas and Amplify are in the pilot stage for some of the middle schools, or?
Savas, I think we have Savas I know for World we're piloting Savas, and then we give specifics. I was referring to Amplify ELA Amplify is not part of the social studies curriculum, but Amplify ELA is our middle school curriculum.
And so the curriculums, I saw several that were OER. I assume that's an open platform of some sort?
Yeah, so that is another super interesting thing. So OER actually has some fantastic parts to it. It's really diverse. It's got really rich resources. It's not all the courses that we're looking at it said, this is great, but it's not enough to call it a curriculum. So it's something that we've already put through parts of it or different grade levels. We've already put it through IMC because we know that we want to use pieces of it, but it's just not quite there to be able to say it's guaranteed viable.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Siri.
So, again, thank you. Siri, go.
So I actually don't have any question. Well, I will eventually have a question, but first I did want to just say thank you so much on the community representation component, and the expansion incorporating student voice is fabulous. We had talked about that for a while, so it's great to see it coming through. Also appreciate all the work at really trying to deal with sort of bridging the intersectionality, the equity, the inclusion, and the access into our curriculum. I think that's fabulous as we look through doing that. So nicely done on all of those pieces. Especially appreciate the extensive work with the Native American community and working with using our resources around and being able to build on the whole since time immemorial and all that work. So there seems, as I look, so here is my question, but it's not actually this adoption specifically, is as you've gone through this, what are some of the best practices that you would take from this in going forward with other curriculum adoption things? And the other piece is there was always concern of involving students that they wouldn't have the time or components of the difficulty. What have you found to be true as you have brought students to the table in doing so?
So one of the things that I'd say that we've been doing, I think it's like standard at this point for most of the work that we've been doing in my department and outside, but being able to really tap into the voice of our educators. We use the interest-based process to set our vision for this group. And that was just our teachers and our students and our community members saying, we framed it as, what do we really want for our students? What do we want for their learning and their experience? What's our core values around this work? And what we got back was inspirational and fantastic and has guided our work. We've got every single time we meet, we put up a slide with our interests, and it is absolutely focused on students and focused on learning and uplifting all of our students. So that's something that I'd say we will continue to do, is think about how do we use the ideals and the strength of our educators to inform direct work that has an impact on kids. Part of that was having students in this group, and we've had them in multiple adoptions this year. It's been fantastic because they're really frequently the voice of reason, where we say things like, we think, students will want this or students will want that. And the students will just say, like, here's actually what we think. Here's what we think is important. They are thoughtful. They're well-spoken. They have been just wonderful voices for us to remember. Like, the goal of our work is student learning and experience. And for them to be part of the group has been great. For some of them, like for this one, when we got into evaluating curriculum, it was a little more of a challenge to get them for them to have the time to come to our meetings. But we'll continue to involve them, especially in the implementation, where we can just say, how does this feel? How would you adjust this? I think that's going to be really important. The other piece that's been really great is we've always had the practice in this district of multiple departments being engaged in each other's work. And in this adoption and then in current work, and maybe this was a side effect of COVID, we haven't just attended each other's meetings. We've been deeply engaged in doing the work together. And so, like, working with the equity department, working with tech integration for the math and science learning for the February 23rd, we focused on math and science. We're focusing on increasing access for all students. And so they focused on learning principles. And then we partnered with the tech department to show, here's how that actually can look like using technology. So this wonderful focus on learning and access in an interdepartment work. So I think that's something that's been really terrific over the past 2 years, and then really came to fruition in this adoption, was deeply partnering with other departments because we share goals, we share vision for that. I don't know if I answered all your questions.
I'm pretty certain you did. I appreciate the best practice sort of the concepts going forward. And then the other question, I wonder if you could share with us that interest-based sort of what were those core values at some point, just a copy of that slide. That would be interesting to see how that worked.
Yes, I can answer Chris's question, and Crystal and I can race each other to see if we can find that slide.
No rush for it now.
So I've got one follow-up, but I want to make sure anybody else. Leah, do you? Yeah, go for it.
You can go first if you want. I just had a couple of really quick questions. First and foremost is, I know that it's always been sort of a sticking point, not just in social studies, but overall just in history, being able to find those resources and those first person voices of the people who have not been represented. And I'm curious, I know you said you were actively looking for those resources to try to bring those into our curriculum, but how is that going? Because my understanding is that there's still so much missing that just is not available. And so I know you mentioned that this is going to be an ongoing process that you'll have to continue to revisit, but I'm curious how much you've been able to bring in or find.
Right. We honestly haven't started that yet. We're more in the identifying that there's a need there. And when we make a final decision about the curriculum, about the instructional resources we're adopting, then we'll be able to say, do that scope and sequence and look for voices that are not present. So we haven't started that yet, but when we do, we'll again lean on other departments as well. Like we did some work, Crystal and some of the equity department did some work to support our 5th grade curriculum. And the equity department had a list of resources that we're able to pull from there as well. So there's other places as well. I was talking with, so in a meeting we were talking about that librarians and like associations for librarians also have lists of resources. So when we're identifying needs, we'll go to multiple different places, including the Anti-Defamation League has been a great resource to us to find those voices. So that's definitely work that we'll be looking at in the future.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my other question was regarding, so I think you mentioned when the standards changed, there was a surprising kind of emphasis on some of these, I don't know what you call it, I guess not very measurable goals, right? Like the ability to be a critical thinker or to be able to connect ideas and have intellectual conversations around them. And I was kind of curious, how are we going to measure that?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So some of that may be in the curriculum that we adopt, but some of that will also be in developing the scope and sequence to look at how we measure those skills. But that's a really interesting question because we don't have easy metrics right now to say, how do you measure critical thinking? So that's something that we think about as we think about, like we've been talking about what is the portrait of a graduate and what are the ways that we might be able to say, the 4 C's of communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity, and 6 C's, citizenship, and character, are deeply embedded in the social studies standards. They're also deeply embedded in NGSS and in the mathematical practices. And so I think as a system for us to think about how do we clearly identify, define, and measure those standards will be important. For social studies specifically, there are curriculum-based assessments that we can use within that. But I think you asked a question that I'm really, really interested in for like the larger system of work. So yes, curriculum-based assessments, yes, performance assessments, but what I really love about the social studies standards are those things that are beyond 21st century skills. Like in 2022, to say 21st century skills feels like it's almost outdated, but thinking about like what are those things that students really need. How do we take the standards that identify the skills that students need to be empowered citizens of a democracy? How do we quantify those and then really know that we're teaching them?
Chris, can I just jump in real quick before you? Is that all right? So I agree with Director Choi. It's something we've been wrestling with the board in our conversations for results 3 for years now. And in our extended study session coming up in a week, 2 weeks, I've lost track of the days. Whenever it may be in the next week or 2 weeks, we have on our agenda further discussion around results 3 and the indicators for how do we measure these sort of things. And I think I know Matt Matt Gilling has been working on that quite a bit. So yes.
And so one of the things that we talk about in our work a lot, Eric, is we look at anything that we do needs to have a direct impact on the student. So that's one of those things that I think about with the question that you asked, Director Choi. So how do we measure, if we're looking at these larger skills, how is that something that we're able to intentionally teach and measure in the classroom? So, I know that you're probably looking at State Board of Education and a couple other resources, but that's what I really think about in our work is how does it directly translate to something that the student is able to say, I got better at critical thinking today, and I know that because of, I know I effectively communicated or collaborated, and I know that because of. So I think that's really urgent, fascinating work.
Neat. All right, thank you. Chris, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I've got 2 final questions. And so deferring the adoption or the piloting on government and civics to next fall, I totally get the scheduling problem. You can't pilot something when the class isn't being taught, right? But that also is going to make life really interesting for the teachers piloting these during an election cycle. And so in the specific context of civics and or U.S. government AP, that's something where it is, well, let's just say I hope that you're aware of this and it is going to be something that is worth keeping in mind as these move forward. Mm-hmm. And on a related note is you mentioned civics, but do we have I know we have civics, but do we have, sorry, backing up. Currently got a high schooler And moving through the standard course series where you've got world history, you've got U.S. history, and then government or civics. But civics usually doesn't get mentioned with, they've added a subclause to it on the standards at the state level, which is civics and contemporary world problems. And that's really interesting to me, particularly in the context of one of these orphan topics that I know is near and dear to Director Stewart, which is debate, which, as far as I know, was not in the previous social studies standards. And if there's anywhere it should be, it's in our social studies standards somewhere. So that's sort of I don't expect an off-the-cuff answer that, oh, yes, debate is or is not adequately addressed by but it's something that I'm very interested in. And also, is contemporary world problems part and parcel of our civics, or is that a separate beast in our system?
So one thing I need to correct, I said earlier, U.S. government was paused till the fall. It's actually U.S. history. Sorry, I got ahead of myself.
Okay.
And yes, thank you for, we will absolutely be thinking about our social studies teachers as we're going into an election year. It's been a time to really be thoughtful.
It's going to be a tough year.
Yeah, definitely. So the recommendations that the state board made, or the guidance, not recommendations, we're pacing ourselves a bit so that we'll do that part of the course redesign when we get past this part of it. So that's something that we haven't directly addressed yet. Crystal might be able to speak more to it, but that's our thought, is that we're in this work, and so we'll get to the next step with it. So, and by the way, you are speaking to someone who is a former debate team captain and coach debate for the first 5 years of my life. So I would, if I could mandate it, I would.
I did not know that. That's lovely.
Yes. And yep. I'll leave it there because now you know who I am.
Yes.
But the debate as a separate topic isn't part of the standards, but the concepts of research-based discussion and engaging in a dialogue and all those pieces are in the standards, but they don't specifically call out debate.
Right. Okay.
And if it's helpful, the state civics requirement and the contemporary world problem standards can fall into multiple courses. So again, as Jen or Dr. Rose mentioned, it will kind of fall out during our implementation planning.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mark?
Yeah, having it being part of another subject is, as you know, being a former coach and a former student, is unacceptable. I had 3 years of high school debate, 5 days a week, the entire 3 years, and we were 45th in the nation in education. Now, if Washington State, who is far above that, can't offer that, there's something wrong with this picture. Okay? Same with journalism. But I offer now, Chris opened the Pandora's box. It's open.
I do think those are some of the ways that I learned all those 6 C's are right there. So don't disagree, but not sure it's going to happen in this adoption. But I did want to share with you what our synthesized interests were as a committee. So this came from, let's see if I'm not sure I can make it much bigger, and we can, Crystal, would you mind dropping in the chat? We can have it here for the record, but we can drop it in the chat. This was the entire group going around with every person sharing their thoughts and then going through a process where we synthesize them into our interests. And this will be something that we'll have be dynamic over time. This is what we centered on, but this is something that as we continue to grow and change and learn as a district and as a society, we'll continue to revisit and reprocess our interests so that they continue to be relevant and appropriate.
Thank you. That was helpful to see.
Great. Anything else from anyone? Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Excellent.
And one last shout out. I just want to say thanks again to the committee. They're a phenomenal group of people and they work so hard, and they're continuing to work so hard. So I just want to say thank you so much to them. Thanks for the opportunity to present to them.
Great, thanks. The second item we have on the agenda for the study session tonight is an update on the development of the multi-tiered systems of support. John or Mike, I don't know who wants to kick it off.
Yeah, can I just also comment? It's so impressive to see the changes, shifts, and transitions over the years of our curriculum adoption process. You know, I remember, 10 years ago, kind of listening to what the process was, and each person that it's been handed off to has made it better through a few different lenses. The board's lens has been one of those. And so just want to really appreciate everyone that has worked on that process over the year. I know Mike was one of those people, handed it off to Jen. And so it is really impressive to hear the work that's being done to identify and adopt really good curriculum for our students. So just wanted to say thank you to the process and those leading it as well, and our committees that are doing that work. So our next topic is multi-tiered systems of support. And as the board knows, this is a strategy that we've been working on over the last couple of years. And as we think about addressing the needs of each and every student in our school district, and MTSS does allow schools and school teams to have protocols and strategies to actually address and evaluate the needs of students. And so Mike has a presentation tonight to share with you an update around that, which is a good lead in to our results 2 presentation tonight, knowing that that information has some places and components where we want to address student needs. So, Mike.
Right. Can everybody see that okay? Thanks. As Dr. Holman mentioned, we've been referring to MTSS in a number of different contexts. So, for example, when we are sharing our results monitoring, we say, well, MTSS is one of our ways that we're thinking about addressing the gaps in performance that we're seeing. But you may even recall before even that, part of our special education program review many years ago, that was one of the key areas that was called out, is to develop a tiered system of supports for students that address academic supports as well as social, emotional, and behavioral supports. So I think the board has been asking for a while now to have a little bit more detail about what we're talking about with multi-tiered systems of supports and how it works and how we're planning to install it. So tonight, what I want to take you through is just an overview of what MTSS is and its core components, and then a summary of how we're planning or how we've been working to install or implement MTSS in our schools and district. So more specifically, we'll talk about why MTSS and why we're prioritizing MTSS together with equity and inclusion. They're really closely bound together. Then we'll give you very specific details when we say MTSS. What are we talking about? What does it mean? And then finally, we'll wrap up with how we're mapping out strategies to help schools develop and build out multi-tiered systems of support that actually help each individual student in their school. So as I mentioned, MTSS is very closely tied to equity and inclusion. And when we look at how our students do, we recognize that, and we see in our results data, that there are students who are not performing at the same level, and that we're identifying as something that needs to be changed in our schools. Because if we're not seeing the results we want, that means that we need to have a different way of approaching our work. And so MTSS really is one of our ways that we're trying to address the differences that we're seeing in performance and the equity and opportunity gaps that we're seeing in our schools. And really to try to do away with the predictability and the correlation between race and performance. Excuse me. In addition, MTSS really is closely tied to a number of the frameworks that we use in our system. So, for example, the Association of Washington School Principals has a leadership framework that our principals use, and it's actually part of our principal evaluation system that has many of the components of MTSS actually built into and reflected in that framework. Similarly, with our teacher evaluation tool, very much the same there, that there are components of MTSS built into that. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a quick drink of water here. And then again, you may recall when we developed our strategic plan that back in 2019, we incorporated MTSS into that strategic plan. And again, that MTSS, that multi-tiered systems of support, is very closely connected to our inclusionary practices work. And the structures that are part of MTSS allow us to do a better job of including students in their schools. And it's a major part of our equity efforts as well. And so over the past few years, we've been prioritizing these three in our professional learning and in support for schools. So when we look at our strategic plan specifically, you may recall that we built in the importance of supporting our leadership teams in schools as they establish MTSS and monitor multi-tiered systems of support, that we provide training for them, that we have a plan that actually works out over multiple years. And so, obviously with COVID, we've had to adjust quite a bit, but we are really mapping out, particularly even over the next 3 years, what we would expect to see schools accomplish in each of those 3 years as they're developing an MTSS. In addition, it's important to recognize that when we're talking about tiered systems of support, we're talking about academic and social, emotional, and behavioral supports. And so part of our MTSS work is really building those structures to help kids succeed academically and behaviorally. And we want to have that happening in each school. In addition, we said in our strategic plan, we'd build capacity through fiscal and human resources. And so as we think about when we're adding, for example, teachers on special assignment or people that can work with our schools, we are really thinking about how do they support MTSS as part of a larger picture. And then ultimately, as we're thinking about supporting students, we know that our community connections, our community partners, our social service agencies, and our community agencies really are a part of that support for students as well. And so ultimately, MTSS braids and weaves those into the efforts as well. So those are the specific items that are called out in our strategic plan. So now I think, as I've been saying, MTSS, it would be helpful to understand specifically what do we mean when we say multi-tiered system of supports. And so in general, the way to think about this is it's really an array. It's a range of instructional, behavioral, and social resources that are delivered as needed based on data to each individual student. So if a student is struggling with reading, they get just what they need for reading just in time. If they're struggling with behavior, their support's built in right away. They don't have to wait weeks or months to get those supports. That there's a system already lined up to identify the need, to identify the support that's needed, and actually to implement that support. More specifically, though, when we're talking about the core components of MTSS, at the most foundational level, we want to make sure that every student in our school has access to core curriculum. And that's not only academic curriculum, but also some of the behavioral social curriculum that we've been working on. So Second Step is an example of that we use in our schools to make sure that we're instructing students how to succeed in school. And so if students don't have access to that curriculum because they're being pulled out or are in a separate program, then they're going to be at a disadvantage. And so one of the first steps you do when you're thinking about establishing MTSS is you say, does every student have access to that curriculum? One group that we're working and we're really honing in on is our students with disabilities, because we know in many cases when students are in programs, they might not have the same level of access to the general education curriculum that all students should have. So that's the first foundational thing. That's kind of that base of the tiers that we're talking about. The next step that you need to then have in place is what we call universal screening. And so when we share the FastBridge information with you about our academic assessments that we're using, we want to make sure that every kid is assessed on a regular basis so that if a student is struggling with the core curriculum, we can quickly identify where they're struggling and what their need is. And if we don't have that assessment in place, then students can kind of continue along and maybe we never apply the intervention or support that they need. So the universal screening for academics as well as behavior are kind of that second most important part of MTSS. Then to actually have MTSS work in schools, to actually successfully say, okay, one, are we making sure all kids have access to core instruction and curriculum? Two, are we regularly assessing how they're doing so that we can apply evidence-based interventions? You actually need teams to do that effectively. And those are teams that are in place at the school level in terms of a grade level team of a group, say, for example, of third grade teachers that meet regularly and look at data. It also is a team at the school building level that's has oversight of all of the areas in the school, not just the grade levels, but how social and emotional supports are in place as students are walking in the hallways or sitting at lunch, how our assemblies are instructing around curriculum or behaviors. And so really that building level team is looking at the big picture of the school and making sure that we're monitoring how students are doing, we know what we're monitoring, and that there are supports that follow. And then when additional supports are needed or resources are needed, that team really is kind of helping there. And then in addition, you have a district level team that's has oversight of our schools. And so those teams really are foundational if you want MTSS to work, because if a teacher on their own is doing this work, it becomes really difficult if they need additional resources or support to call that out. Whereas if you have teams overseeing that, you actually have these processes in place to identify them. Then, as we talked about tiered supports, here's where we say when a student really isn't responding to that first level, that core curriculum, then what's the next level of support that's maybe more intensive? You apply it with more frequency or with a greater intensity, and you monitor, see if that's working. So if a student isn't responding to core reading instruction, what are the skills that they need to be successful with core reading instruction, identifying those specific skills, and then applying an evidence-based intervention in a very specific way, and then monitoring how that intervention is going. And that's for any student who needs it. So it's not, you can say, well, this student I think isn't doing so well. You actually say any student who is doing at a certain level on an assessment is going to get this evidence-based intervention. And then obviously you want to monitor to see how they're doing, to see if the intervention's working, and you typically want to do that for a period of time to make sure that you're giving the intervention enough time to work. But if over time that intervention isn't giving you the results you want, you're either adjusting the evidence-based intervention, you're making sure you're delivering it appropriately, or you're trying a different intervention, or maybe even thinking about a much more intensive level of intervention. So that progress monitoring has to be in place for a system of supports. I mentioned earlier community resources, and so particularly as we think about our social service agencies, those are key partners. If we're thinking about making sure that a kid's getting what they need, sometimes that's a support that exists outside of the school that we need to bring in. And so that's a key part of it as well. And that support is monitored sometimes at the building level, but also at the district level. And then finally, you need leadership to make sure all of this is working. So our principals are overseeing what's happening in our school. We have a district leadership team that's overseeing kind of our district implementation. And so all of these different components need to be in place when you're talking about a multi-tiered system of supports. So this model of multi-tiered systems of supports actually started out as a public health model. And so, for example, if you think about like when a person goes in for a checkup, you know, we check kind of their vitals, we make sure they're healthy. And if they are, then they continue doing as they are, maybe having a good diet or taking care of their fitness. But as you start to see through, for example, a screening tool of some sort, that there is some kind of intervention needed, for example, person's having a hard time breathing, they need to stop smoking. And so you put them on a plan of intervention to try to address the health issues that you're seeing. So it started as a health services model, but it also has been used in our public education. So as I've described to you, when a student's not responding to an academic support, then you intensify that support. And that support becomes more intensive as the student, for example, doesn't respond to those lower tiers. And that also we find works for behavior. So we have these different systems out there. We have health systems, and even in our schools, we have health-related issues that we have to attend to. We have academic systems, and we have behavioral systems. The idea with MTSS is rather than thinking about all of them independently, and sometimes you do need to think about them independently, but in general, you also look for where there's overlap. And so, for example, sometimes a student's behavior is related to them struggling academically. And so if you address the academic need, you may address the behavioral need at the same time, or vice versa. A student who maybe is struggling with academics acts out in class because they don't understand the content. And so you want to be thinking about how these different areas are related as you start to address the problem. And that doesn't necessarily mean to say that if a student's struggling with reading, you're going to go right to looking at their behavioral data, but you should be thinking about it as maybe one of the factors that contributes. And so the idea of MTSS really is starting to bring all of these different things that we're trying to teach and instruct in our schools together under one kind of framework. So this starts to make a little more sense as you think about it, maybe not as necessarily a tiered triangle, but as the level of intensity or support that's provided. So for example, if we think about what are we going to provide to all of our students, we think about that as universal support. So we have a team that's making sure that we're delivering the curriculum to all students. We're looking at data about how all of our students are doing, and then we're continuously monitoring that. So for example, if a large number of our students at a grade level or a school really are struggling, that really kind of points you to, well, maybe it's the actual core curriculum that's something we need to address. So for example, maybe half the kids are getting a concept. Maybe we need to go back and look at the way we delivered that instruction in the first day and really start to work through it. So that's kind of the universal, and that's for all students. Probably not as intensive on the support that's provided, but we make sure that every single kid has access to that universal support. Then at that second tier, as you move up, that's when you start to intensify the support, but that's going to be needed for fewer students. So if you have good core instruction for all, that should address the needs of most students in most cases. But in some cases, some students don't respond to that core instruction. And so this might be where you pull small groups together and you do more intensive interventions and support for them in addition to the core. So this doesn't replace what they get with general education instruction and curriculum. It's in addition to that. And if they respond to it and get on track, good to go, and then they kind of rejoin. Or if they're not responding to that, then we can go to an even more intensified support. And this is really for a small number of students. So if you have good core curriculum in place, you have good kind of that second tier of supports in place, you should have very few students that need this more intensified support. But again, as we think about each individual student and the range of skills and knowledge we want them to acquire, sometimes kids need a very intensive support. And that intensity can come from a greater frequency of an intervention. It can come from more time with an intervention, depending on how much a student needs. And again, this is not to replace core instruction, it's to be in addition to core instruction. And so that might be an individual student or a very small group of students that really are getting that intensified support. So again, you can kind of think about it in multiple ways, but these are the tiers that we talk about when we're talking about multi-tiered system of supports. So briefly, and not to get into all the details of this, but I wanted to kind of walk you through how this might flow in a school. And so this is an example from our first grade literacy kind of framework for how do we map out what should all kids get, and then what do we do when maybe we're trying to find out how kids are doing. And so, for example, we've shared the idea of we do universal screening with FastBridge, and so this idea of we get an early reading detailed report that points out where specific needs are for individual students. And for example, if there's no risk identified in that, then the student stays in their tier 1 core instruction. But if we are starting to see some areas of need, we might do kind of that second tier where there's a small group instruction, and that would be provided by the classroom teacher. Or if we're starting to see some more specific areas of need that require much more intensive support, then we actually start to apply that maybe with a safety net teacher and some more specific curriculum resources that are tied to intervention. And we make sure that those resources that are tied to the intervention really are evidence-based, that they have a foundation that actually points to research and past practice in schools that say when you use these things in this way, you get better results for reading that actually help kids access the core. And so these flows are managed by teams. A grade level team would look at their data, will determine what the student needs are and what the areas of need are, and then they will identify how do we provide support if students need it. Do we need to bring in an interventionist? Do we need to think about additional supporting curriculum? And then how do we monitor that over time to make sure kids are responding and acquiring the skills? So that's kind of how it might play out in an individual grade level. So just to wrap up, kind of as we think about the big ideas, MTSS really is an equity-based and it's a needs-driven framework. And so it really is designed to meet the needs of each individual student using data to identify where those needs are. It also allows us to continuously improve our practice in our schools. And it really is the operating system. So it's not the strategy itself, it's the operating system that fits within. So that gives you a high-level overview of MTSS, and as you can imagine then, taking this large kind of complex framework for supporting students and then pushing that into schools and working as a district to make sure that we're implementing effectively does require a very intentional effort over time. And so the last part of the presentation tonight is just to talk briefly about how we're planning to, or how we've been working to install MTSS in our schools. So we know in working with our state partners, as well as work we've done with a group called the National Implementation Research Network, that whenever you're thinking about implementing a new program or practice in your schools, you really need to be thinking about what we call implementation drivers. And there are a number of things that have to be factored in. In addition, for MTSS, we know from a large body of research that there are things that need to live around MTSS. So, in addition to the core curriculum and the assessments, you need leadership teams. You need to be thinking about the culture and climate in your building. You need to be thinking about how students and families connect with MTSS and the infrastructure that you have as a district to support it. So if you just say, well, schools go out and build a system of supports without thinking about leadership or thinking about the community context, then typically you don't see the same outcomes in terms of implementation. So the way that the National Implementation Research Network kind of frames this is, to get effective implementation, you need to think about kind of these three big buckets or areas. One is, are the practices you're using effective? And so earlier I mentioned we use evidence-based practices for literacy instruction. We know there's a large body of evidence that talks about how kids learn to read and the best ways to instruct them to do that. So if you need to, one, make sure you're using the right practices, because if you're not, if you're using something, for example, off Pinterest or a teacher pay teacher site that hasn't been vetted and we don't know is good, you may not be using an effective practice. So that's one thing that needs to be in place. Then the next level is you have to ask yourself, are you implementing that practice correctly or effectively? And the way it is intended to be implemented. And that can happen at the support level, at the intervention or the tiered support level. But it also means, as you're thinking about how do you implement this larger system, how do you effectively do that? And then the final part is the enabling context. So all the people that live around MTSS and how they support and enable MTSS to actually take place. So do you have a leadership team in your school that's overseeing? So if you have all of these things in place, you get improved outcomes. But the other thing to remember, and just kind of as a model or an analogy, is if any one of these things are at zero, that you're actually probably not going to get effective implementation. So if you don't have effective practices, even if you're implementing something as it was intended and you have people to support it, you're not going to get an effective outcome. Or if you have a great evidence-based intervention, but you're not implementing it appropriately, you're probably not going to get the outcome you want. And so you have to be thinking about all of these things to have effective implementation. So another way to think about this briefly is the effective practices are the what, the effective implementation is the how, and then the enabling contexts are the who and where and how, what we're doing. And all of that leads to better outcomes for our kids, which is ultimately why we're doing this work. So in terms of what these look like very specifically for our schools, we're using, and I think we shared with you, the Swift Education Center, we're using a framework that they provide where schools can actually assess all of those areas I mentioned. So leadership, the MTSS structures themselves, as well as the family partnerships. And so what we ask our schools to do is do an big picture overview assessment of all of these areas and identify areas that they need to work on first. So for example, a school might say, as we look at, if we do this assessment, our school culture really is needing some work, and that's contributing to students having a harder time with social, emotional, or behavioral outcomes. And so that's an area we need to focus on and really build out. So one is you need to identify what we're shooting for and then assess how you're doing. Then once you have that, you can actually start to develop plans. And so you have data that says school culture is really a high-level issue and that we need to work on. Then you identify some priorities. And so you say that's going to be kind of our focus for the year. And what resources do we need to make that happen? And then you design a plan to work on it. So it's in some ways similar to the school improvement process that we've shared with you over the past years. But it really is focused around a very specific assessment of your MTSS and the surrounding supports that need to be in place to effectively do that. And then ultimately, we also want to establish teams. So we want to make sure that buildings have grade level teams and building leadership teams and a district implementation team. In addition, we're also working with state partners that really help us to oversee the effectiveness of MTSS. So those teaming structures really are kind of foundational to multi-tiered systems of support. And ultimately, all of those coming together are the ways that we start to see improved outcomes for kids. So just to go a little bit more into fine grain level size, when we talk about schools assessing how they're doing, as I mentioned, we want them to be thinking about MTSS. And so multi-tiered systems of support includes academic and behavior, but also, as I mentioned, those things around it. So do we have a building leadership team? Do we have a structure that's in place in the school to actually allow us to have that team meet? Are we working with our families and community? Because we can do these things all day, but if we're not making connections with our families and they don't know about the supports or their role in them, they're going to struggle. And so these are all the areas that schools are going to really do an analysis and an assessment of to determine how they're doing. And there's actually specific indicators for each of these areas. So a school team can say, let's evaluate how we're doing and then monitor their growth over time for each of these, because we know if we put all of these in place, and there's a lot of evidence and research behind this, that we start to see those improved outcomes. And so each school has been tasked with doing this assessment. And then ultimately, we're going to be monitoring those over time. And so, for example, this was based on some research that the Swift Center that I mentioned earlier, which was one of our partners, did with schools as they were mapping kind of in composite to see that when schools are measuring these things and then putting those plans in place, that they are actually starting to see improvement in each of these areas. And then as they see improvement in these areas, then they start to see following that improvement in student outcomes for academic, social, emotional, and behavioral. And so as a district implementation team, we're monitoring the implementation of these different factors. And then we're also going to be monitoring, or we are monitoring, our student performance. And we want to see, are those things moving in the same direction concurrently? And so the assumption is if we do a good job on the fidelity, on the quality of implementation, we should also see a change over time in student outcomes and student performance. So as we think about how do we help our schools do this, I mentioned this briefly already, but our goals are to get our schools to have an MTSS leadership team that conduct that assessment that I just mentioned, that they use those assessment results to establish priorities and put practices in place based on the results. And then we also have a district leadership team that's overseeing all of this. So when a school or a group of schools maybe is struggling with implementing in a particular area, we can push supports in for that. Or if we're not seeing student outcomes as a result of a good implementation cycle, we can push in those evidence-based interventions and supports for those, whether it's professional learning or resources or curriculum. So at a district level, what that looks like is we provide, and we're working to provide, coaching and for implementation of that initial assessment. So we have a facilitator that works with the school to do the assessment. We work with schools, and we want to have schools partner so that we can do problem solving. So when one school says, hey, I really am struggling with how to set up this behavior system, that they're not on their own, but they actually have colleagues that they can work with in other schools that maybe have tried things out, and so they can share that idea. And then again, we have those teams in place that can oversee this, and so we're helping our schools form those teams. So as I mentioned, we have had some delays as we marched through COVID. We were on track to really make sure every single school had their assessment done in the fall. As you know, that was the time where we started to see a pretty significant spike in COVID cases, and then really went through the roof in January. So some of these things were on hold, and we've adjusted our timeline a little bit. Right now, about half of our schools have conducted the assessment, so we're working to get through and make sure that they have those by the start of the fall of next school year. And then we also want to make sure that our schools are digging through their academic and behavioral data, and we're setting up systems to do that. And then we're providing professional learning for our school teams so that they can actually monitor that data over time. As we've moved into the spring and the fall, our goal was to have schools set MTSS goals. And so some of our schools have been able to set those, but now as we're kind of getting back on track, the goal is by the fall of 2022, every school has set an MTSS goal or goals to build out structures of MTSS over time. And then over time, they should be adding to those areas that they're building so that ultimately they have a well-structured multi-tiered system. That they have a team in their school, that they're identifying needs to accomplish those goals, and then the district provides support for those, and then we're continuously problem solving with those schools. So that was for schools that had not yet conducted the FIA, and so that's kind of the timeline for them. The assessment I mentioned is the FIA, the Fidelity Integrity Assessment. We also have some schools that are a little bit further along, and so it's slightly different timeline for them. We want them to be regularly reviewing those results and constantly adjusting their plans to improve. And so they're a little bit further ahead. And we're using those schools as examples for our other schools that are maybe a little bit further, not quite as far along on the process of establishing MTSS in their schools. So ultimately, I've kind of walked you through why we're doing MTSS, a belief that we want our students to be successful and included in our schools. We don't want race to be a predictor of their success. We've talked about how we establish tiered supports in our schools and the importance of having a tiered system to make sure all kids get the core, and then students who need more get it. We've talked about some of the structures in place for how we actually create systems in our schools in our district, bringing evidence-based approaches, not only for the supports we're using, but the way we implement those, and then the importance of teams in our schools to make sure this happens, and teams at the district level to oversee this work. Ultimately, we're not quite as far along as we anticipated that we would be when we started this school year. In fact, even in August, but we are slowly getting back on track as things are starting to stabilize in our schools now. And so ultimately the goal over time is for each school to have that assessment done, have that MTSS team in their school, and then really to be applying those evidence-based interventions over time. So that's the presentation. I have some time for questions, and then we can wrap up.
Trying to figure out how to raise my hand. I have a question. I'll just do it this way. So, first of all, thank you. The sort of top level reaction I have to all of this is, wow, this is a lot that we're doing, and which is great. But also, I guess could you talk a little bit about how we're ensuring buy-in at the school level to all of this? Because boy, I mean, this is a heavy lift, right? And a big change, I imagine, for a lot of our educators. So,
yeah, I think it's a little bit of intention, then COVID, and then how do you recover from that? So the way we started in August is we all of our building administrators, we did kind of a high level overview of MTSS. We walked through the kind of what I shared with you already. We also asked, and again, this got sidetracked a little bit, is that the building leaders share that overview with their staff. So we want all of our staff to understand what MTSS is, why we're doing it, how we're planning on doing it. Then the next step is to have a building leadership team. So most of our schools already have a leadership team in place that oversees kind of their instruction and their academics and behavior. And so the next step is that we actually work with the building leadership team. We give them a very specific overview and training and actually help them to facilitate the assessment. So we have people that actually push into schools to do that. I don't know if you know, Jeff DeGollier is one of our principals on special assignment. He's been actually going into schools helping to facilitate. Stacy McCrath, one of our directors of special education, has been helping as well. And then before COVID, we actually had a team of TOSAs that were prepared and trained to do that as well. We've been using them to actually cover schools, and so their availability has been a little bit less. So we have people that push out into schools. And then, as I mentioned, we have a district leadership team that's looking at that data that's coming in. So ultimately, our job will be to say, okay, have all schools done their assessment? And if they haven't, make sure that they get some support to do that. And that support is one of the ways that you share, like with the school, how are we doing it? You talk with them through what do you need, how are things going, where may there be some misconceptions, and you kind of help them through that. Once they have their assessment done, then again, there's training that's necessary for the evidence-based interventions. And so, for example, Kelly Pease has been working for years on training around literacy supports. And so that, again, the learning for the staff comes through that professional learning. So there's quite a bit of professional learning. There's people who are in our schools helping the school staff understand it. There's different levels in the school of understanding that's necessary, a building-wide overview, a leadership team overview, and then the professional learning that comes along also helps to build that understanding. But you're absolutely right. It's a large, complex system, and it takes years for people to actually start to conceptualize it and put it into practice.
And then just a comment, and then I'll leave this. I want to say I appreciate the thoughtfulness, and I think the slower pace that we've ended up having to go about this seems like the right approach too. I don't know who. Mike, I'll let you call on people.
Yeah, I can look at Leah, it looks like you were next.
If I can unmute myself. So I guess my question is maybe more around, I don't really know the details and the nuances of the program, and therefore this is potentially a naive question, so I will apologize. But is there, I guess, the example that you were giving earlier about maybe a student who isn't demonstrating, the same results as the rest of their class, and then also having potentially behavioral problems, and those two things, they could be related because he's having a difficulty in class, or he or she or whatever is having difficulty in class. It's translating into kind of the behavioral issues, and then being able to target and figure out that problem. Are we ever worried about jumping to those conclusions when they might not be related? Or I don't know how to phrase it.
Yeah, no, that
makes sense.
Yeah, and that's
mainly because like our some of these evaluations need to be done from professionals.
Mm-hmm.
And are we prepared to say that our teachers are going to be equipped to make those connections?
Yeah, I can walk you through a concrete example of this. So a student who, I think he was a second grade student, would regularly put her head down in class and disengage, and in fact cry when curriculum was happening, and the teacher really wasn't sure, and saying, and she was living with her grandparents, and there were just a lot of factors, and so the staff really was working on how do we get her to engage more, and they were trying a behavioral system of support. So they were giving her rewards when she participated, and calling home when she wasn't crying, and really working from a behavioral standpoint. And so those are kind of just bread and butter things. You see a behavior, you try some things out.
Right.
What they started to see, though, is that the student was doing those things when it came time for her to read, whether it was reading independently or reading as a group. And so you could just see a very clear, put her head down, stop reading. And so once they started looking at the assessment results, they were seeing the student really was a struggling reader. And so when she was put into a literacy intervention, some of those behaviors started to go away. And so you're watching both. You're watching, okay, does she continue to disengage in class? And does that seem to be diminished when her reading improves? So some of that's just straight back and forth. You see a cause and effect. Some of it, though, like you just mentioned, and another example is there might be an assessment done by an outside professional, and sometimes those outside professionals are actually invited into the team meetings. And this might happen more at a building level, or the professional's report is provided to the team to say, actually her behavior is probably more a function of this, or this. We also have educators in our district who can do those behavioral analyses. So that's the community part of MTSS. If you have that community connection, sometimes that outside expertise is brought in as well. But sometimes it's a straight, you see a cause and effect, and when you start to work in one area, you start to see changes in the other. What I would say is if the team wasn't looking at both the academics and behavior, however, they might have absolutely missed the connection between them and not been attending to those because different people were working on the behavior than on the reading intervention. So the goal is to bring them together in the same room and have those conversations. And then, as I said, oftentimes outside folks are brought in, or reports are brought in for the teams to look at.
Thank you. Those examples are very helpful.
Chris and then Mark.
Yeah, so conceptually, I get this. I'm behind it. Operationally, I'm a little bit worried, and it, as Director Liberty pointed out, it's a heavy lift. And what I'm wondering is, for the people on the ground who are trying to implement this, is going to be teachers and building level admins. Is this something where there are other systems that they are currently using that are taken off of their set of responsibilities, or is this just another tier that gets added onto the cake of existing responsibilities?
What we're trying to do is look for where areas where there's connection. We call it braiding the different areas. So, for example, our inclusive practices work, right? So we want our students with disabilities to have the same level of access to core instruction. So that's, you might say, well, the school's working on inclusionary practices. Do we take that off? Do we take MTSS off? Well, actually, MTSS is the way we help students to be included in their classes. So if a student needs more intensive academic or behavioral support to access core, then MTSS is kind of our framework for doing it. So MTSS is kind of a larger umbrella that a lot of different elements connect to. Inclusive practices, the core curriculum Jen was mentioning tonight. Do we make sure that all kids have access to social studies curriculum? So even though it sounds like, well, the social studies adoption is one thing and MTSS is another, there's actually a very strong connection. So a lot of the things I think you're talking about really should get braided into MTSS. The challenge is helping people see those connections so they don't feel like these disparate initiatives, that they really are braided together. But even that, that's a complex task too, because you have to understand MTSS to see how things are connected.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, but no argument. It's a heavy lift. Yeah. Mark. Oh, Mark, you're muted.
Well, for a second, it went back on. That's not fair. Okay. The buy-in by the teachers is very important. I understand. And I mean, after all, you go to all this work, and if it's not implemented on the ground, it's all for naught. A quick question. How are we trying to assure buy-in from parents? If we've all heard, I don't want those kids in my class. They're bringing down the level of instruction. They're going to disrupt. They're going to do this. We've all heard those.
Yeah.
And we've all had our eyes roll and want to throw things at them. But that said, that sentiment's out there. And how do we get past that? How do we get the parents to buy into the fact that this is a necessary and this is a requirement really of the education system, and how their student actually benefits from it, to be quite frank.
And I don't want MTSS to sound like this panacea, but in some ways it does address that. So as I mentioned earlier, community and family engagement is part of your tiered system. So as you're building leadership teams, looking at your family connections and your family communication, that has to be part of your system of supports, right? So again, a concrete example of a school I observed and was aware of. So a student, significant behaviors, throwing desks, injuring others, stabbing with pencils. And so sometimes the classroom had to be cleared. Parents were calling the principal saying, I want this student in another school. And so part of what that MTSS team did obviously is work around the behavior. So they identified what's the behavior we're trying to reduce, what are we going to monitor, how are we doing that? But part of the work that team grappled with as well is what do we share with the students in the class when a student starts to escalate? How should the whole class respond? And the kids actually were part of that conversation and talked about, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give them a little space, or there's a sensory place. We're going to say some kind, encouraging words, or sometimes we're just going to have to go to a different space while the student's taken care of. But he's one of our peers. And then that led to a conversation with families about, okay, how are we responding when the student who is expressing himself in a different way needs some additional support? And what's our approach? And so having an MTSS actually allowed the school to say, here's how we respond, here's how our kids are, here's how we're keeping your kids safe. And we're a whole community. So this student has a different need than another student who has a different need. So when you have a good MTSS in place, you can point to what the school's doing. You can think about the communication strategies that are actually part of the support that student needs. So ultimately that all weaves together. But again, it's I think what people have been saying in here, it's easier said than done. But it should be something that the implementation team or the MTSS leadership team is building in as part of the conversation about how do we make sure our school is a welcoming, inclusive place. And if you have those things in place, you can communicate that to families. The last thing I'd say is sometimes families, and in fact, our goal is to have families on the MTSS teams as well. And so they actually help with that engagement that you're referring to.
My concern is, that's an extreme example, to be quite frank. You got this kind of omega, if you will, at the other end of the spectrum. I think that's the fear that every parent has of when you're blending of the classes. When you're having these classes come together, they're thinking of the worst case scenario. And they're thinking that each one of those kids is going to be a quote unquote time bomb. I find the students, to be quite frank, more accepting than parents often. I know with our son, we had some students that became like tutors, almost unofficial, and it actually helped them focus on their academics because they were able to see where what was missing for him.
Yep.
But how do you? I guess it's a cultural change, and I don't know really what the answer is. I like the idea of including the parents on the MTSS teams, but so they see that not everything is an extreme, like a kid throwing desks.
Yep.
It's the kid who has a vocal tic.
Mm-hmm.
It's the kid who has hard time sitting still and needs to get up, move around the room, come back to his seat, and everything's cool. That's where my concern is. And in fact, I've seen the same thing from teachers, to be quite frank. Oh, I'm just waiting for him to explode. I'm just waiting for her to do this. Well, you're not going to have very much success if that's always in the back of your mind, and you're not going to be able to engage that person.
Yeah, thank you. And that's actually a more important point that I think than even like you're saying for that extreme behavior, because ultimately, if you have these systems in place, then a student's needs should be getting met. And so in addition to those evidence-based interventions, sometimes, and some of those evidence-based interventions are like some of the things you described, like I'm going to connect you with a buddy or a partner in these situations. And so it might be like the cases you described. I also can think about schools I've seen where there's an older partner reader who helps a younger student do reading. And so the older partner is someone who maybe is struggling with acceptance in the school, and the younger person, somebody who's struggling with reading, and putting them together actually meets both of their needs. I think one of the things you pointed to that's really important, though, is if you say to a teacher, figure this out all on your own, in isolation, not connected to the larger community, that's a much different challenge than if they're part of a larger system. So what I just described with the younger and older student is if you have a school team that's looking at that, they can actually help to align the older students and the younger students to actually do that support. So that's looking more holistically. And so I think the short answer to your question is ultimately the system of supports is designed to meet those needs, and that team's responsibility is making sure that that kid's needs are being met. And it doesn't have to be extreme. It might be some just day-to-day needs that they have.
Well, I think it points out the need for for lack of a better term, a program to help sell it to parents, an outreach to parents to show it. This is how it works. This is how it's going to work. This is the benefit to your student as well as this student. And once they see that, then I think they're going to have more acceptance. I mean, it's the same way that you try and sell it to a teacher, to be quite frank. But with the parent not being in the room, all they're doing is imagining the worst case scenario. So if there's a method for selling it to parents, in fact, a plan for selling it to parents, I think that's the next step, to be quite frank.
Siri.
Yes, thanks so much for the overview of MTSS and just sort of giving that framework. And if I'm following sort of how this was put forward, this really is a framework that all the interventions and things can fit under and how they lay out. And so it's not prescriptive, as you said, in that regards, but allows for multiple issues to sort of be holistic in its approach. Is that fair?
Yes, and again, that's the complexity of it as well, is it should be an umbrella that captures most of your supports in your school.
And so with that, so thinking as the implementation process and knowing that this isn't new, our schools have been doing pieces of this at all times. This is just a structure that's being sort of overlaid to it. Mm-hmm. How long would you expect it to be for a school to have a fully implemented MTSS model? And when would we expect that to impact those outcomes?
Yeah, so we're mapping out right now 3 years of benchmarks to say, by this next year, all schools should be here. By this year, the next year, all schools should be here. And the following year, all schools should be here. To your question, our first goal is to create fidelity to that system, right? To make sure that you have a team that's overseeing data, that you're actually administering the assessments. So that's all called fidelity. Are you actually implementing MTSS? That has to be in place first, and you're making kind of a leap of faith. Like if you do those things, you're going to see improved outcomes, but there's a lot of evidence that schools and districts that have these systems in place do see those outcomes. That being said, at the same time, we are, right now, we're actually identifying the specific data that our implementation team or district team is going to monitor. So literacy data, behavior data, and fidelity data. And then we're mapping those together. So there'll be a dashboard that says, okay, where are schools in the MTSS framework we're using? And how are we doing on those key measures? Those are the same measures we're reporting to you. So for example, third grade literacy. Are we seeing improvement in literacy as schools are doing a better job of fidelity? So by having a way to monitor how schools are implementing, we can see, are they doing what they should be doing for MTSS? Do they have a team? Do they use their data? Do they have a plan and a goal? Then we can start to see, is there a correlation between achievement? But the achievement's kind of a lagging indicator, for lack of a better term. It usually is a few years behind. And so, again, it's kind of an investment on the front end with the fidelity to get the outcomes and the achievement. That being said, it's not like we're ignoring reading instruction while we develop this system. Kelly's Pease is working on next year's K-3 literacy professional learning already, and we're kind of mapping out the needs based on what we're seeing in the data. So we are working on the academic and behavioral supports, but ultimately we want those to weave into MTSS, and we should see better outcomes because we've been sharing for years. We're seeing flat performance in a lot of groups. And so ideally, if we build the system out, we should start to see some upticks there.
But still expecting that to be a ways out, even with the addition, I mean, the true impact of the model being implemented is probably at least 3 years out. So the other question is, I know you have schools at different phases of implementation. It would be interesting to understand what the difference I might see walking into a school with a full implementation model of MTSS versus one that does not. So I don't know if there's some insight that can be given there to be able to sort of understand that piece. I just think of our inclusion models where you have some of those pilot schools doing it.
And are you interested in something now or just longer term to see something? I can give you a quick overview of kind of what we would expect to see in a school that was a little bit further along right now. Is that what you're asking? Or did you?
Yeah, and actually I'd like to see it. And
yeah, absolutely. So two things, like I said, in a school, schools that are a little bit further along have an MTSS implementation team. They've conducted a building assessment. They've set some initial targets, and they have a plan for those targets. And then we're pushing in supports to help them with those evidence-based interventions. That being said, we do have schools that are further along. And so if board members did want to see, we could have, for example, a board member participate in a building leadership team, or even in the initial assessment of their school. So if that is an interest, we could schedule those. Yeah.
I would, because I actually think that gives a good idea of sort of where you're going through and what it happens. So, and to speak to this and actually getting to Director Stewart's point, how do we become a voice or advocate in being able to speak to this? The more we understand it, the better we're able to speak to it within the community and the value behind it. So I appreciate all those pieces. So yeah, I would actually be very interested in being able to, we're doing a lot of process right now. I'm hearing a lot of the how. And so my concern is that, you know, every year we go forward, we have another class that gets through a certain grade, and knowing that we're in sort of a need to accelerate some of the learning that's even based off the data we've just seen in the R2, that how do we ensure that we're accelerating at the same time that we're creating a system that can outlast that sort of component going forward?
Yeah, and that's part of the work too, as I mentioned, of the district implementation team, is to monitor not only the fidelity of the MTSS, but also to be monitoring those achievement measures, because we may say, you know, okay, the school's leadership team needs some work, but the school also needs some help with literacy instruction. And so we're not going to wait to get your leadership team developed to get that good practice in place. And so some of these things can happen in parallel. So I also just want to be clear, we're not saying, well, we're holding on all the academic instruction and professional development. Ultimately, the building implementation team weaves those into their work.
They actually work in parallel, I'm assuming, as they go forward, is what the goal is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mark?
One last question. As I'm looking at ways to help sell it to the parents, it would seem to me that the logical reserves, if you will, or logical people to call upon would be the PTSAs. Have we been working with the PTSAs to having them brought along as you're going through this process to show, okay, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's how we're going to do it. And then when it comes to this point, we're really going to need you to help us sell it to parents, to explain to parents why this is so good for every student.
Yeah, at a district level, we haven't engaged around MTSS specifically, though it's part of our inclusionary practices efforts, and it's one of the strategies. So I think you're right, Mark, that could be something we absolutely beef up. Then at the building level, again, I think once a school is kind of building these structures out, then a school should be engaging their local PTAs as well, PTSAs as well, to say, here's how we're doing it. So typically what that looks like is a principal typically does a principal report at a PTSA meeting, and they say, here's the work we're doing around our tiered systems, and here's how we're meeting the needs of our students. And so we can provide our school leaders with information that they can share, so we have a consistent message.
But I'm saying to build that in, so it's not that on the principal to think of it. Gee, I ought to present to the Parent Teachers Association.
It's part
and to have and basically have a structure how to make them evangelists, if you will, of the system, because there's only 5 of us, and we've got a few more PTSA members than that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hey, Chris, I don't think I see any more questions. All right, Eric, sorry. I thought Chris popped up on my screen.
Anyone else? I think we're good. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
A stunning amount of information packed into a presentation. Thanks. When you started and I saw how many slides there were going to be, I was dubious as to whether we get through it, but thanks. Okay, so 6:51, that was the last item on our agenda for the study session tonight. We have a board meeting to be held at 7 p.m., also remotely. Just a reminder to all the board members, separate link to access that meeting. And since there are no items on the agenda for tonight, the study session is now adjourned. See everyone in 8 minutes.